you for taking some time out of your busy schedule to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month with us. We are excited to celebrate the success and progress of the Hispanic people in the US and the world during this month. And I am honored to be moderating a panel, a nice conversation with very successful Hispanics that we have with Improve. Let's get it started. A little bit about me. Um, in case you were wondering, my name is Leandro Margulis. I am leading product marketing at Prove. I came through the Unify ID acquisition. I was born and raised in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and moved to the US in the early 2000s. And the fun fact about me is that I'm not really good at soccer, so I had to leave the country. I know, we have a good reputation for playing good soccer, but that was not me. As panelists, we have Mimi and Les. They will do a much better job of introducing before I pass the baton. So Mimi was born and raised in Portland, Oregon, but her father was born in Lima, Peru, and moved to the US when he was in his 20s. Mimi has been working in startups since 2012 and moved to New York City in 2017 to fulfill that lifelong dream of living in the big city. She currently lives in Westchester with her husband, dog, and cat. She's also terrible at soccer like me and loves to dance like me. So looking forward to an in-person event where we can show our dancing skills. And Lester currently fulfills his curiosity exploring the depth of digital identity, mobile authentication, and fraud prevention for Proof. Aside from that, he's rediscovered his passion from learning and working on some educational ideas, which are inspired by his 2-year-old's love for exploration. He was born in Venezuela, raised in the new Bitcoin capital, Miami, Florida, or capital city of South America, and currently lives in Austin with his wife, dog, and daughter. So with that, I told you a little bit about them, but I will let them introduce themselves a little bit more. Mimi, can you tell us a little bit more about you?
Sure. Yeah. So we're going to talk about this a little bit later in the session, but a little bit differently than Les and Leandro. I was not born in South America. I was born in the U.S. And so I've always connected to my Hispanic heritage through my dad, and that's always been an interesting part of me. But I'm really excited to talk more about, some of the stereotypes also that exist around Hispanics in the workplace and some of the things that we've encountered personally. But also really stoked to talk about I think there's an onslaught of more awesome Hispanic and Latino people I've spoken with even in my career. I kind of start to see more and more of them. So that's super exciting to me. And I hope to bring, I'm always about bringing diversity into things. I love all kinds of viewpoints and thoughts, and so that's always what I'm trying to do, and excited about encouraging Hispanics into that discussion as well.
Thank you, Mimi. Les, tell us a little bit more.
Yeah. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Perfect. So I honestly think you covered all the fun stuff about me, Leandro. So the only thing I'll add there is that, living in Miami, I got exposed to probably every Hispanic culture you can think of in the melting pot. Like you mentioned, it's the capital of South America. I don't know what else I would want to add to that, but I definitely, to Mimi's point about diversity, to me, one of the biggest things that I've always experienced, especially in Miami, is the diversity of thought and the diversity of culture, and how kind of those conversations really are influenced by people that were raised in different areas. So even if we're all Hispanic, depending on where you are in South America or Central America, there's a lot of nuances that only Hispanics really can identify with each other. The other day, I was able to pick up a specific person I was speaking Spanish. I'm like, oh, I know that person's from here, but my wife cannot pick that up at all, right? There's nuances. So to me, it's always interesting to dive down into kind of what those culture differences are, and I'm really excited to kind of explore that here in this conversation. So.
Cool. I think you bring actually a really good point, Les, because we talk about Hispanics, but the reality is that sometimes there are a lot of different different subgroups there that perhaps they get all lumped in, right? When I say that I'm from Argentina, if somebody asks me, "Oh, so you like spicy food or you eat tacos?" That's completely not me, right? I mean, in Argentina, it's more of an Italian influence in terms of.
You're also the fancy ones.
Well, the joke I say, I used not to be arrogant, but when I left Argentina, now I have a reputation to maintain. There's a cultural thing about European influence versus Latin and going on in different, depending where you are from in Latin America. By the way, I will be asking questions to Mimi and Les, but if you have any questions during the session, anything that you want to ask the panelists, feel free to Slack them to Tyler, and we will tackle as many of them as we can. So, actually, Mimi, you brought a good point when you were introducing yourself in terms of, hey, perhaps it's different than Les or myself in terms of you were born in the U.S. So one of the questions that have come up is like, U.S. born Hispanics versus people that were born somewhere else and came here. I heard that sometimes being referred as Hispanic versus Latino. Some people use it differently. Some people lump everything around Hispanics or Latinx. I would like to get both your perspectives on that. If Mimi, you want to start, that would be great.
Yeah. I think Les and I may have somewhat agreed as we discussed this before, but I'm not super into the categorization of or bucketing of both, because to be honest, like I've spent a lot of time in my life like connecting myself to my like Hispanic culture and trying to like integrate myself more deeply. I mean, where I chose to live in Westchester, the town I chose to live in has a huge Hispanic population. I chose to live here for that reason. It's important to me to like maintain that connection. So I understand the differentiation between like you were born here or you were born in South America or a Hispanic country. But I do sort of feel like it's an arbitrary categorization. Like, I think people select and certainly there are people who don't choose to connect their culture that way, and that's perfectly acceptable as well. I really feel like it's more related to like how that person views themselves, and rather than let everyone else categorize them. I don't really put myself in one or the other. I do when I have to check the box on something about my race, I say I'm Hispanic and I say I'm white. And I also think like you didn't ask this specifically, but like I do, I personally am fairly like white passing. So that's always been like an interesting part, I think, of like my identity with being Hispanic as well. Like my father's 100% Peruvian. But I, have always like had like a little bit of an identity crisis, and it's really only been, I think, in our adulthood, as for many people, that you start to become much more comfortable with like who you are and what all those experiences brought to you. So I definitely like have, when I was younger, struggled a bit more with like how to feel connected to that part of me. I think sure, categorizing myself as Hispanic is one way to do so. But I also, like I said, I spend a lot of like conscious effort on also how to just like maintain my connection to my like Hispanic heritage, which I get through my father, but I like to be around more than that as well.
Thank you, Mimi. Les, do you have any comments on this particular point?
So if I could ask one question, because I have never, I personally, as a lifelong Hispanic, don't know the distinction between how do people use the word Latino versus how do people use, and again, I was raised in Miami where it's like, it's Hispanic Day every single day. So how does that word get used distinctly in conversations now? And then maybe I'll give you my 2 cents on it. So
I think that the use of terms is evolving. A few years ago, I heard people using Hispanic as you could be first, second, third generation Hispanic, right? Hispanic heritage. But you're a Latino, like, I mean, people will refer perhaps to you and I, Les, as Latinos because we were born in Latin America. And in a way, there's a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of there could be differences. I'll give you, and it's also depending the approach that certain people take in terms of adapting to a place. I have seen Hispanics, second generation or third generation people with Hispanic heritage, that they don't speak Spanish and they regret it in a way, or they long for it. But it's also about the decisions that the immigrants took to be able to adapt or over-adapt, right? So sometimes we make certain effort to adapt, but we also celebrate differences, right? So there's also there's a difference there, right? But once again, I think there's a lot of similarities that put us all together in a group. But there's also nuances that it's important for people to understand in the way that people may represent themselves or feel.
Yeah, I feel like with what you just finished describing to me, like now I'll be able to have a clearer distinction between the two, right? So, in terms of how I connect to what's one or the other, I mean, as you've been, as I've been saying, I'm Hispanic, right? So I should have said I'm Latino because I was born in South America. One of the things that I did want to add to what Mila was saying is like she moved to a specific place, to be connected to that, to kind of like that Hispanic culture, heritage, or background that she and I don't know if you use this word maybe, but like long for. For me, it's the experience has always been the opposite. I've always already by default been in that environment. So it's like the sense of belonging and the sense of connection to Hispanic and Latinos has always been there. It wasn't until I moved to Austin that I felt myself like I want to speak to somebody in Spanish, and every time I do, they look at me and they're like, "No, talk to me in English." And I know they're Hispanic and I know they speak Spanish, and so for me, like I don't have a connection between one or the other. I just like to understand the just more so like the cultural background and being able to just connect in general on the diversity of the two cultures. So I think in large part I agree. Like Mimi and I talked about this before. Like I don't agree ever with any type of subdivision of groups, just because although it gives you the ability to express like what you're trying to identify with, I think furthermore just creates more division, and it's like really not really that necessary. But that's how I kind of think of it. I don't know if that answers the question directly, so hopefully it does.
I think you touched on a lot of good points that it's kind of funny. I'm assuming people that are not Hispanic are like, well, I mean, should I say Hispanic? Should I say Latino? And by the way, it's not that you these are just definitions. Like as I said, the terms are evolving. Right now, the term is like Latinx, or people are using Latin with an at the end, just to make sure like we're inclusive. I think that the spirit there is great in terms of being inclusive. We need to find the right balance in terms of being inclusive, but also celebrating the differences, right? And that's always a tension. So I mean, I'm not sure there's a clear answer, but at least you're seeing a little bit of the discussions that are happening within the Hispanic community and beyond, in terms of how we are defining terms. We tend to try to put everything in buckets, and sometimes not everything can be messy, right?
It's easier that way.
Collectively exhausted. Yeah, I know.
And when you're looking at data, it's much better, no? Yeah.
I wouldn't expect anything less from you, Les. Mimi, any other comments on this?
No, I think some interesting points got brought up around language, which is kind of interesting. Like, I am fluent in Spanish, but I have a massive accent, and I very much was born like U.S. is my English is my first language, and so that's always been sort of interesting as well, because I sort of straddle both sides. Like both Leandro and Lester don't have very strong accents at all. Probably Lester a bit more than Leandro, but I really do. You can definitely tell when I'm speaking Spanish, and I think that's as somebody, I think that's true with all cultures, that kind of like immigrate to the US. Like there's always an interesting question of how do you associate to the language of your like heritage, and where do you speak that? And when you speak to, I said I identify as Hispanic, but I do have a very strong accent. So it's kind of funny because, people will always, like, especially Hispanic or Spanish speakers, will always point it out to me and be like, oh, you must be more American than Hispanic. And that's always created kind of an interesting like identity crisis, I think, for me as well. It's added to it for sure. But there's definitely, like, as I started to think about languages, I started to also think about like Americans are kind of notable for loving to like bucket people into like geographical areas or countries, right? But even like there are a bunch of even countries and regions that are extremely diverse that we just lump into like one thing. Like I not to like call things out, but like India, for example, it's a vast country, but it's actually geographically extremely different. But we are always like, well, it's Indian people. So I think that happens. That's an example of a country. I'm saying it does happen in regions as well. But I that got brought brought up, and I definitely agree with that, which is like we talk a lot about like, oh, the bucket of Hispanic people, but those are a lot of countries, to be honest, with a lot of history. Leandro pointed out the Eurocentric history versus more Latin history. Like even within South America, there's a lot of different stereotypes that we hold of each other, just related to like your Eurocentricity versus more your like your more native history, if you will. That's always, I know in Peru, for example, there's a very definite difference between the Eurocentric looking Peruvians who are more like lighter skin, if you will, versus the folks who are definitely more native looking. And there's a huge divide in honestly just caste system. It's not as like structured, but there's a pretty large divide between those kind of groups for sure. So even within those cultures, and if you start to look at like the histories of them, there's some really interesting, I think, nuances for sure that start to play into the different stereotypes of areas and what what different things are different about those regions.
So thank you for, in a way, bringing us to the next question, Mimi, in terms of stereotypes. I would like to ask each one of you what kind of stereotypes you have dealt with. And by the way, thank you for saying we have no accents. I can tell you, Les has more of a Venezuelan accent. I definitely have an Argentinian accent when I speak Spanish. And I definitely have an accent when I speak in English. So what can we do? One of the stereotypes that I found in terms of accent and the way we speak, and in my case, it turns out to be true, and I think for some of you maybe as well, I speak too fast sometimes, right? I mean, and some people compared to how people normally perhaps speak English in terms of the pace and tempo. So I don't know if you encounter those kind of things or other stereotypes. We'd love to understand a little bit about the stereotypes that you have encountered. Les, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. Stereotypes, the question that I want to ask is, and I always do this, is what do we want to define as a stereotype? Because I feel like there's many, like, depending on which level I can describe. Like, for example, Mimi just touched up on identity crisis between languages, right? Like someone seeing that she's can speak Spanish but a very heavy accent. Or we could even go down like a little bit lower, where it's like, I speak to other Venezuelans and my parents are deaf. So I never like developed the full like speaking, like my first language was sign language, then Spanish, and then English when I moved to the US. And then when I moved to the US, I had to essentially relearn Spanish because it was very different, right? And so like, when I speak to other Venezuelans, a lot of the times, some of them will be confused as to where from Venezuela I am. And so, like, I think I can first, let me ask this: what do we want to describe as stereotypes? Because I've experienced them differently between different groups, and then maybe I can like dive deeper.
I will, for the purpose of this conversation, let's think about what kind of stereotypes about Hispanics in general you have encountered as a professional in the workforce.
I've always worked in I come from the finance industry. Everything I've ever done has been with South and Central American clients, and so, man, I think I'm going to struggle here. I think. Mimi, help me out here. What stereotypes do you think? I'm going to need some ideas because I don't think I have a clear one in my head at the moment.
Not to make this even more complicated, but I also struggle with this one because I do encounter stereotypes, but to be frank, it is a little hard to differentiate between whether it's stereotypes about being Hispanic or about being a woman. And so that is probably an interesting perspective. It can be hard to tease out what feels like somebody making, having a bias based on what part, I mean, I've definitely when I was younger, that I've heard the stereotypes, and like my father is 100% Peruvian and looks very Peruvian. Like he's sort of told me like experiences he's had. Like I find the funniest stereotype like to be sometimes like that people have called him like lazy, or that Hispanics are lazy, and I just find that wild because truly they're like some of the most hardworking people, and like it's so antithetical to like most, just like Hispanic culture is efficient. It's not lazy. We like to be efficient for sure. And like, we like to not spend a million years on a task if we don't have to. But I do think it's not lazy. It's actually extremely hardworking. So I feel like that's one I can for sure say, like, somebody else I know has experienced that one and I've heard it stated. But yeah, I do. I mean, Lester, to that point, I kind of struggle to like tease apart for myself what is related to what. I don't know if I can point to something that I thought that was stereotypical because I was Hispanic.
To add to what you just said, go ahead, Les, please.
No, I was gonna say no, you know what? Go ahead, Leandro. Let me gather my thoughts one more time.
Okay, I just quickly wanted to add to what Mimi said in terms of that particular stereotype. I mean, Hispanic people are very hardworking, contrary to what some stereotypes may be. And I will give you a personal experience. My first internship, they saw my name and they created something for me to do. What they thought would take me 3 months took me 2 weeks. And then it was great for me because then I could do whatever I want with the internship, but that showed me a little bit of the stereotypes that they had. So that's just something to take into consideration. We're talking a decade ago, but I do think that some of those stereotypes still exist and they're not true. And hopefully we're showing how far the community has evolved and is evolving. We have some data to talk about that as well. But I mean, definitely some of the stereotypes that you hear are not true. I know it's easier sometimes to take a shortcut with stereotypes and buckets, but we're not statistics. Contrary to what Les may tell you, always working with data. So, Les, I know you had something else you wanted to share with us.
Yeah, it was something that Mimi. I like to try to go off the top of my head. It was something that Mimi touched up on in terms of like the labor aspect of work, right? Like my parents are Cuban. Cubans tend to be very loud. And then also the type of work that they do is very like manual. So I think Mimi hit up on one of those that maybe I've kind of experienced, but I struggle to tease them apart just because I'm immersed in it. It's like the fish that swims in water doesn't know that they're swimming in water, right? So like I don't know what's a stereotype and what isn't. I think the top of mind for me would be the type of work that gets done. Like I helped a buddy of mine. I was in between work because I decided to change transitions. It was actually right before I changed careers. It was right before I came to Prove. And I was helping a buddy of mine scale one of his glass polishing companies. And I was doing a job at this beautiful mansion. And the guy was a trader. Like he was a retired psychiatrist and he was trading. And he immediately like looked at me and it tried to speak Spanish without ever thinking that I spoke English. But then right after that, like lumped me in as just as I don't know if this is the right thing, but it's like he just lumps, like a lot of people just lump in with like, oh, if you're doing work, you're from Mexico kind of deal. So like that happens a lot in South Florida. So, I think that's probably the only example that I have in my head. And that's more of, I guess, yeah, lumping someone in and just judging based off, what they think they are.
Thank you for sharing a little bit of your personal stories and experiences in terms of stereotypes as well. I know we touched on a lot of interesting topics right now. If you have any questions or any comments on this that you want to share, please Slack them to Tyler so we can address them. That would be nice. And I wanted to move to one of the next topics in terms of, I know Les in particular is all about data. Mimi and I are too, but Les in particular. There's actually a Hispanic Institute called like a part of Pew, and if you look at their stats, you see how basically the Hispanic community is gaining more purchasing power in the U.S. I mean, it's evolving. It's evolving professionally. Gaining. It's progressing. Perhaps not as fast, and it's not as represented in the positions of leadership as we would like. But it's moving forward. So I would love to understand in general what does that mean for us. Mimi, if you can share your thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, I look at this from like I come from consumer products before Prove, and so I look at this kind of in the context of like how we think of and sell products, right? Like it's always like it's increasingly become important to provide inclusive messaging, but also we are starting to see like in neobanking, it's a massive trend right now that a lot of the banks and stuff are targeting themselves at really niche markets because it's a way to sort of create a community around those niche markets, and I think some of those trends are actually going to carry over pretty significantly into other types of consumer products. So I think with the increase in purchasing power, I think we'll probably start to see, there's neobanks dedicated to Black communities. I think there's not too many in the US, to be honest, that are dedicated toward Hispanic communities who actually do have different needs, right? And I think some of that kind of community building and some of the thought around, how to build products that are more specifically for a group and a segment, that more purchasing power the Hispanic population has, the more incentive there is to like provide and build products that are going to support them. So I do feel like we're seeing these metrics improve, but also with time and with innovation, truly, like these products will continue to improve. And in the context of Prove, I think I started identity verification because I was really passionate about enabling more types of customers to access products and financial products specifically. So we always talk a lot about like un and underbanked populations, but I think there's an opportunity for us and other, identity providers, but for us to think as well about how to better target, these, again, more community-based populations to make sure that we have the data necessary, that we know who they are well enough to give them that access to those products that they need, which will improve all their outcomes.
Thank you, Mimi. Les, anything to add there?
Yeah. What I hope for really is that the idea that the increase in the purchasing power really like translates into like what Mimi's saying, access to the different products and the different kind of like sectors of capital or resources, along with the ability to educate them. Like one of the things that I feel like most of the Hispanic or Latino families that I have ever encountered, especially in Miami, struggle most with is how do they make the decisions for the proper decisions with this new ability with this increased ability of purchasing power, right? And so like one of the things that this excites me, like the ability for that this group here to have more money, in their pocket, or the ability to go and expend this kind of money is fantastic. One of the things that I hope that group runs in parallel with is really the educational aspect of like the finance, right? Like, increasing the purchase power doesn't always equate to the ability or the allocation of those resources properly. So one of the things that I hope like all this translates into is really the educational component of like, how can actually that increased purchase power translate to a better quality of life? And I think that's like huge. That's a huge need within Hispanic communities that I have experienced, including my own family and myself. So I don't speak of this as a third party. I actually speak from it as like internal understanding and learning. So
perfect. Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing that. Moving a little bit more into the stats and something important in terms of a business perspective. In addition to having more purchasing power and getting more into positions of leadership and influence, Hispanics are supposed to be the largest minority within the U.S. as well. So I think that's from a business perspective, it makes sense for businesses to represent the audiences that they're serving, and also for us to actually keep that into consideration as we are, preparing our marketing positioning, product marketing. How do we go to market with the opportunities that Mimi was discussing as well? I don't know, Mimi. It seems that you were talking a little bit, and we have an investor and board observer.
Yeah, Roger Roger reminded us. Roger put me on a call with Ralph De La Vega a little while ago. Ralph is a board observer and an investor, and was at one point the CEO of AT&T, or a subsidiary of it. And he's a really interesting guy. He immigrated from Cuba. I'm kind of reading off. He wrote a book about this matter, but I did actually really enjoy meeting him. But he wrote a book. He came from Cuba in 1962 and essentially built himself up to the CEO of an AT&T subsidiary. So he has a really interesting history just in listening to him talk, even in the context of a business meeting. You can see that he has a really varied viewpoint. He's seen a wide array of things in his life, and I think he had a really interesting way of kind of leading and thinking about AT&T as he sort of grew up, and really was very self-made by definition. So anyways, I think it sounds like he wrote a book on this. Actually, I haven't actually seen that piece, but knowing that he was a very interesting person to talk to, and very charismatic, I'm sure it's an awesome book.
Yeah, so the book is called Obstacles, Welcome Adversity and Advantage in Business. It's on Amazon, and we would love to do a Q&A with Ralph De La Vega. I think he would enjoy it as well. So that could be one of the follow-up events in terms of celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month. We actually have some questions from the audience that they wanted to ask the panelists. So you both talk about your kids. So the question is, what do you tell your kids about identity? Are they American, Latino, Hispanic? How are you weaving this into your kids' education?
I don't actually have kids. I have fur kids, and they are very much born in the U.S. No, I mean, when I do, I've thought a bit about this. In the future, I definitely would say you're American Hispanic. You are American, but you're descended Peruvian as well. Your grandfather was Peruvian and came here when he was young. And again, it's why I moved where I am, because in the future, my hope is that they'll actually have a connection to speaking Spanish primarily, and to that culture, as much as it's harder for me to provide it to them, being around other kids that are, that speak a language that will be new to them, but that I would love them to learn and have. That's kind of my position on it. But I don't currently have kids, so I'd be curious to hear from Les how he's actually explained this.
I think it's a question that I probably still struggle myself as an adult. So I don't know how I would translate that to my daughter. The many times that I've discussed this exact topic is when someone asks me where I'm from. My parents are Cuban. I was born in Venezuela. I was raised in the U.S. And I always say I'm Venezuelan. And then as soon as they find out that my parents are Cuban, they're like, "Oh, but you're Cuban," And so I wonder. I don't know if I could say that I've thought about it. But she's only 2 years old. So I can't say that I've really thought about trying to instill her this idea of identity. I would say this, that what I have thought about identity in terms of her in my child is that as she starts developing this personality, you start to see that she is developing her herself in a way where she's kind of can self-express and kind of relate to things on her own. And the only thing that I would hope in terms of when she's developing that identity is that she takes the parts of me that are beneficial for her, whether they're Hispanic, from America, whether it's wherever they're from, that she develops that into a better identity for herself. And that, I think that would be my approach to kind of that conversation with her. Obviously I would love for her to be able to take in all the heritage, and to be quite honest, I personally don't have a lot of background of my own family history, just because again, it's the communication, it was very limited between my parents that were deaf and the lineage of that. So that's a great question, Moses. I think that's the best shot that I have at that answer, at that question right now.
Yeah.
Thank you, Les, for the answer. I have a follow-up question regarding this, and thank you, Moses, for the question. And in a second, I'm gonna give you the virtual mic so you can ask a follow-up question as well. But one of the things that I don't have kids yet, but one of the things is I would like to talk to my kid in Spanish to start, so at least they do that. Are you doing that, Les?
So the short answer is kinda. And the primary reason, so my wife's background is Jamaican, Indian, and European, doesn't speak any Spanish. And a part of that is I teaching her sign language, trying to teach her Spanish, and then English. So we kind of in the house, to keep the answer short, is we've stuck with the English as the primary to develop like the self-expression aspect of it, and then we're trying to instill the Spanish and the sign language kind of like dripping it in. So fingers crossed. I'll let you know how that goes, Leandro.
And perhaps other languages too. So
yeah, hopefully.
Yeah, Moses, I think you have a question you wanted to ask.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Les. Thanks, Leandro. It's a follow-up to actually a point that Mimi raised, and that's initially why I asked this, which was the point of the identity crisis she went through when she was young. I guess to rephrase the question, Mimi, what would you have preferred, like somebody tell you to help ease that identity crisis as a young child? Like, what are some of the things you're like, oh, if I had this, maybe that would have helped in me kind of understanding this whole complexity?
Yeah. Something Les said actually kind of reminded me of what provided that tension to me. And it's so I'm totally fine with the question, where are you from? But for me, I'm from Portland, Oregon, but people don't mean that. And so it's the continued question of, but no, where are you from? And I hate that. Like, I just don't know a lot of people that love that line of questioning if your skin isn't white, because it's like, if you ask the first time, the person's going to tell you what they identify with, and that has to just be the answer. There is no further answer, right? If they're not going to provide it to you themselves. So Moses, like, very tactically, that happened to me a lot as a kid. I was a little darker when I was younger, so a lot of people would be like, where are you from? I'm from Portland. But that's how I would answer. And they would be like, no, but where are you from? And that makes me start to feel like, I don't know, where am I from? And so I definitely think being conscious of the way that you're asking, especially kids, but specifically adults, those types of questions is one like major way. I also think I have a bit of a unique situation. Like, my parents were divorced when I was super young. So I grew up with my Peruvian side and I grew up with my like very American side. And so because there wasn't like always a huge crossover between those things, it always made me personally feel like they're separate things, they're separate categories of me and they don't really overlap much. So I definitely not to like blame my mom, but I think having a deeper understanding of how to think of me as both, she's very like American Eurocentric, like how to think of her child as not simply one thing or the other, but like a combination of things. Like, it's awareness, I think, of both parents, that like there's lineage on both sides, right? And those kids should be respected and melded together in whatever way possible. So, like, very tactically, my husband like loves Peruvian food. He's definitely very white and American. Like, I'm sure when I have children, like, food and Hispanics love a party, like party culture, like those are things I want to try to mix together as like future parents, so that both sides feel like they have the responsibility for like creating a more like homogenous feeling experience. To me, again, they were just very like separated. So that was a lot of why I was like, is it one or the other? And also just like culturally speaking, Hispanics, like we've said a few times, are like, we do tend to be a smidge louder and like there's some things like that. So I always felt like when I was with my American family, I was kind of one presentation of self. And when I was with my Peruvian family, I was kind of another. So again, I think that to me is resolved though by parents like sharing a bit more of that like cross-pollination.
We're definitely citizens of the world, and there's more to one side to all of us. I'm gonna move to the next question. As a Hispanic professional, have you had any mentors and or sponsors, and if you can also differentiate between the two, that help you get to your career, get to where you are in your career today? Go ahead.
Happy to go first. 100%. I've definitely had a lot of mentors in my career. I'll be perfectly frank. None of them were Hispanic. I have definitely had, mentors of all genders and other races and ethnicities, but actually never Hispanic as I think about it. So that's definitely an area of opportunity. I I do a lot of like advising and mentoring myself because I want to provide more of that in our world, and so I like to do that as both a woman and someone who's Hispanic. I think seeing more people who look like you and have similar backgrounds as you is always makes us feel more, more part of things, so I do this a lot myself, but I'll be honest, I did not receive a ton of this from Hispanics, although it's been fun as I've progressed through my career to meet people like Ralph, and I met the CEO of Opportune, which is a small dollar lender out of Mexico. His name is Raul. So I definitely have seen more like CEOs and executives who are Hispanics and spoken with them in the past, and that's awesome, but still not a lot of female Hispanics, I'll say.
Thank you, Mimi. Les, anything you would like to add in terms of your professional development?
I think mine might be the inverse. All my mentors and sponsors are probably Hispanic. I can't say there's a whole lot of them, but definitely I don't think I would have the understanding that I do of the world and what I do now really without that kind of like that mentorship or guidance that I've had through all. I think all phases, right? So as I went through like the majority of my career, I would say a lot of the times it was always that the manager or a manager from a different department that I kind of would lean on to really find kind of my way in either the organization or within what I was trying to do in terms of my role. But I definitely contribute anything and everything that I do, and any of my successes definitely to someone else that has paved the way before me. And in my case, a lot of those have been definitely Hispanic backgrounds. Again, I think that's the default interactions that I've had in my life.
You, Les. I think it's really interesting to see both points of view that we have here, right? I mean, and in terms of the mentorship and sponsorship, which, by the way, we can go a little bit into the difference between those two. But I don't think that all your mentors or sponsors need to be from your background. I think we actually can learn a lot from somebody from a different point of view. So, Les, I think there's an opportunity for you to also look at other types of mentors as well that we can learn from. And there's an opportunity. I know Mimi has been expanding that core, right? I mean, being able to have not only like a particular mentor, but some kind of like a personal board of advisors, right? I mean, to go to different people for different things. One thing that I wanted to clarify is the difference between a mentor and a sponsor. And I don't know if Mimi and unless you have experiences, but mentor is more about mentoring, helping you with particular situations. It could be direct line of management or not, as Les was saying. But a sponsor is somebody more of an executive that is actually sponsoring your career, not in terms of money, but in terms of being an advocate for your career. And those two roles could be together, but sometimes they could be separate as well. So I think it's important sometimes to make the implicit explicit sometimes to clarify that in terms of what you're expecting from the other person as well. So. With that said, I would like to go deeper into this and ask both of you, what do you suggest companies can do to support Hispanic development and success in the workforce? Mimi, if you want to start us off.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like it comes back to the same methodologies we talked about probably in the like Women's Month as well. It's a lot of being conscious of the type of teams you're building and of going out of your way to seek diverse candidates for those things. In my experience, the best products are built by the like most ridiculously different people with all different viewpoints, and it tends to be tumultuous. But if you can understand how to like harness the power of all those different viewpoints and make a decision and move forward, it means you've considered all viewpoints as you're building something out. So I guess to me personally, I think the way that companies have to support Hispanic diversity is really the same that we would support any diversity, right? Is just making sure that we're being conscious of who on teams not necessarily identifies with different things, but just hiring and promoting people with different viewpoints, people who say things that might not be shared shared knowledge or shared statement. I really seek out those people who, you know, kind of go out of their way to be themselves and be individualistic, because I think that and also promote space for that and give people the opportunity to have those crazy ideas and throw those at the wall. So, you know, I think it's a pretty similar to other things we've been talking about in the world today. You know, there's all kinds of racial diversity that workplaces need to, and gender diversity that workplaces need to account for. But truly, it's, to me, being diverse across a multitude of things and hiring people onto teams with all different viewpoints. That's, I think, how we get to the best result.
Thank you, Mimi. Les?
Yeah, I've thought about this question in many different, I would say, scenarios and environments, and the answer that I always come to is much less about any individual subgroup, and it's more about just like the individual person. So I think I agree. Not I think I agree in pretty much with everything Mimi's saying there, and it's like what the biggest thing to shoot for, like the biggest objective, should always be the ideation or the ability to build something kind of robust, and that normally comes from a diverse set of people with diverse set of ideas, and many times even within Hispanic groups, a lot of those those ideas can be different, or they could be or the same, and so like I feel like a lot of the times, or to try to answer the question more direct, I think the best way I think any organization could probably try to tackle this like kind of objective of like being more supportive of the Hispanic community is really to get a deeper sense of what that person's background is, either through the hiring process or like getting to know that person a little more, you know, on a personal level, and see how that background, like their Hispanic culture, has really influenced their way of thinking, versus just the idea that it's a subgroup of Hispanics, and like bringing in a Hispanic is going to change the idea, but in reality that doesn't always work that way. So you know, I think it really stems at the individual level, and then to dive a little further, when you look at the individual, it's like, how did that Hispanic kind of culture really influence the thought process, and does that thought process that person experienced feed into and benefit the ideas that the organization is actually trying to deliver, and not just the Hispanic group as a whole. Hopefully that's kind of in the realm of what you're trying to get to.
Thank you, Les. To add to what you're saying, I mean, and what I've seen also from other companies as well, is as we're growing, we tend sometimes to be to end up being in silos, and I think that's actually a problem. And if you look at the Venn diagrams, you know, in terms of silos within our organizations and silos between the people that we consider we have common ground and so on. So sometimes something like an employee resource group with an executive sponsor, regardless of the executive sponsor being Hispanic or not, but being able to, in a way, create different connections with the network to be able to, for the organization to communicate better, has helped create, a better work environment, better products, and be able to provide that connection and that diversity that both Mimi and Les have been talking about.
Also, just to quickly add, I think it's important to look at a slightly more macro level, or micro level, actually, because, you know, oftentimes we're like, look, 50% females in an organization. If you start to break it down and look at the teams, you're like, why are all of them in marketing? Or why, you know, like there tends to be pockets, I think, of like diverse people, you know, and that is what I find not that helpful. So just simply saying, look how many percentage of Hispanics I have in my organization is not really the best way of looking at that problem. It'd be better to say by group, by silo, by whatever product team, whoever, you know, whatever the categorization is, how are we doing in that area? You know, because I do still think Proof has a little bit of that, where, you know, there's homogenous groups, like a few smaller homogenous groups, and there is a lot of diversity in the business, but let's look and understand, like, is that in one place, or is it actually pretty diverse across things?
Thank you, Mimi. I think Aditya had a question for us.
Hey guys, firstly, very good discussion. So thank you to all three of you. But I do get a feeling that, you know, Leandro, you actually want to show us your dance moves, right? Isn't that what you really want to do?
Hopefully in person soon. I would love to.
You know,
Is that the question, or?
I'm sure Tyler will be okay with it if you were to step back from the camera and just show us. It's not a problem.
I will leave that one for the next in-person meeting, and we'll keep a little bit of mystery.
So hey, I do have a question for you, because I don't think I actually know. I do have a number of friends from the Hispanic community, but I know you guys talked about kind of the stereotypes, and most of these stereotypes typically have a negative connotation, unfortunately, and that's for any ethnic community. And I think as Indians we face the same. But I want to flip it and ask you: is there a superpower that you have because of your cultural heritage and because of something that is unique to your cultural traits that you have and most other people don't have? Is there one such thing that you can identify?
I think community is a huge one. Hispanics are extremely community oriented. Like, we often have multiple generations living in households, so we tend to, like, everything is really considered from a community perspective. Like, Peru literally has like one of the most extremely socialist presidents right now, and that's that he was elected as such. I think that's like a huge superpower, is we are oriented toward thinking about like other people and other things and bringing people with us, for sure. I also, just one other quick one, like, we do tend to be rather like loud and opinionated across all Hispanics, which is a superpower. Like, you don't really have to often guess what is going on and what we're thinking. Like, we'll be pretty forthcoming with what that is. I definitely see that as like a pretty, that's not for everybody. There are obviously always introverted people, but across Hispanics that does kind of hold. I think that's another huge superpower. It's just, it's directness, but also like love and community, which I find those things together actually to work really well.
That's good. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, do you want to add to that?
I think she hit it on like dead on in terms of like community. Like, the Hispanic community is very welcoming. Like, if you come to their house, they're gonna cook. Like, you can come over for lunch and they're gonna cook you a paella, or like they're gonna always try to like make you feel very welcomed. And a lot of the times the home is like it's very full. Like, there's not a lot of like quietness. And so, like, I think the ability to like embrace, like, allow people to feel embraced by your presence, I think Hispanics do an amazing job at that. I feel like when you talk to Hispanic, a lot of times there's a lot of emotion, and there's a lot of like, I talk a lot with my hands. A part of that is because of the sign language, but the other part is like the Hispanic community in itself is like, they want to get to know you. They want, like, when you say hi to them, they give you hugs, and it's like there's no real personal space. And I think one of the superpowers there, I would say, is that ability to actually make someone feel very welcomed very quickly, and allow that kind of like relationship to just really develop naturally. And so I would say that's very much at the top of the list, on top of some other ones. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that both of them said. I would also add that it's not unique to the Hispanic culture. I do think that there's other cultures like Indian culture and any like romantic culture or like comes from like Italians. Italians also talk with their hands a lot, right? I mean, but in a way, I do think that ability of that warmth about making you feel very welcome very quickly is actually a superpower.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments, reactions from anybody else?
So, Leandro, I thought I'd ask. I was going to ask a question that kind of got answered. Like, but what more can we be doing? Like, what should our board, me, the management team, others know to help support our desire to be more diverse? I was going to send a note that's somewhat related, not directly related. We got approval at the board meeting to add two new board members. Typically, boards are based on who invests in the company, so we don't select the board members. But now that we can actually add independent board members, it's the opportunity to become more diverse. So our first person we nominated that got approved is a woman, very impressive, former president of Verizon. She's super impressive, and but our desire is to diversity is, you guys couldn't have said it better, especially I thought the point Mimi raised around our metrics. Well, what, like, is it the way that we want it to be? So it's not just everyone in certain groups are one versus the other. So maybe slicing and dicing better to know where we really stand. But I guess my question, to get to the question, is anything I should know that now or in the future that can be helpful as I try to learn more about all the things that we need to do.
I will open that to other members of the audience as well if they have any ideas or if they want to anonymously or not Slack it to Tyler and I can bring them up as well. I do think while Mimi and Les think about anything particular they want to say. Thank you so much, Roger, for sharing what you're sharing. I think it's important. I love that we are going to have independent board members and that you're taking this into consideration. As Mimi said, I think we should slice and dice the stats better. And I think one of the things, I mean, I don't know if it's a full-blown employee resource group or affinity groups or however we want to call them, but I think it is important as we're growing to try to remove silos and being able to provide those connections not only to you, but to other people of the executive team. So people can connect better and, everybody can get a better feedback about what's going on and we can be more representative of the clients that we serve.
Thank you.
Mimi, anything else you would like to add at the moment?
Nope, I definitely think the slicing and dicing of the data, that always shows interesting things, I think. And also, I like that point a lot, Leandro. I think I don't know what it is, but breaking down those silos a little bit and providing opportunities where people who feel alike in some way or whatever have the opportunity as well to connect with people across the organization to sort of share their perspectives.
Les?
The only thing that popped into my head is the ability to, I guess, in the word of inclusivity, is not only just horizontally be inclusive, but also vertically. And because I would say now that Roger brought it up, I started to trying to think, okay, how many Hispanics do I know that are very senior level, right? Versus non-senior level, and not a lot came up in my head. In Miami, that changes, but in my head, I can't really think of too much depth in terms of Hispanics that are up there, right? So maybe if we can include that on a vertical level, like trying to see how far down we could be inclusive of the Hispanic community. So that's the only thing I would like to add.
Thank you, Les. Any other comments or reactions from the audience that you would like to share? All right. If anything, please feel free to either Slack Tyler, Slack me, and we'll make sure that the messages are sent. We have one more question. We have a question from Yuri for the panel, which are, what are the things that would be interesting to know to understand the Hispanic sense of humor?
Oh, man. I have nothing good to say. I mean, because we're I have personally found because we're very open people, we don't have that many things that we're embarrassed about, to be honest. Like, my aunts would razz me with all kinds of ridiculous things that my American family never would have, because we just don't discuss things about like bodies and other things. It's like the taboo topics. South Americans have, I think, far less taboo topics, to be honest. And so if you're talking about sense of humor, we just tend to like be fairly open. Yeah, I don't know. I think that's the main thing I would say for me there. There's a bunch of other things. I mean, Leandro pointed it out. Like, I think within every different country and Hispanic community, there's different types of humor, and like there's different sort of like stereotypes or just things about that culture that are unique to them. Obviously, like there's a lot, like we've talked about, there's a lot of diversity in Hispanic culture. So you end up with a lot of different like perspectives kind of melded into one thing. But I definitely feel like openness is kind of underpins our sense of humor.
Yeah. Once again, Mimi, I think you hit a lot of those points. Immediately when I heard the question, the first thing I thought of, like, okay, which country? Which country? Because I could say things in Cuba, not Cuba, in Spanish, with Cuban counterparts that mean one thing, and when I turn around and I start speaking to like my Venezuelan counterparts, they're like, that either makes no sense or it just isn't funny, in short. So I definitely, the one thing that immediately popped into my head is just Cubans are really, really loud. And when you go out, normally you'll hear them from a distance. So I want to say, like, Hispanics always, we make fun of each other the way we like the different dialects that we kind of speak in melting pots. But aside from that, kind of to Mimi's point, it's like it's very open-ended. Like I don't think we take offense to too much, right? And so sense of humor is very wide.
Yeah, I completely agree with both of you. But in terms of like what you said, Les, depending on the country and like the different things about each country, it's good to know those nuances. So Yuri and everybody else, if you want to know more about sense of humor, you can learn a little bit more about the different nuances of countries, and there's always good jokes about that.
Hispanics tend to be very also stereotypical of each other. I'll just be honest. There's like every country, like you could go down, Lester and Leandro and I could laugh and talk about like the stereotypes of every single South American country and like what they're quote unquote supposed to be known for. Obviously, some of that stuff is just stereotypical and like not true. Some of it is just like, again, because of the heritage or the like really past history of that place, you can start to see where some of those things come from. But Hispanics tend to like be very stereotypical and pointed about other countries. Like there's always feelings about the Peruvians versus the Venezuela. Like, we fight over who invented pisco, which is an alcohol, on a constant basis. And so there's just like things like that just within South America that are shared, I guess.
Or who ceviche is better, Peruvians.
That's a very large topic of conversation.
I think there's actually one more question for the panel. That it's given our experience and knowledge, what are we doing to support the younger generation?
That's a good one. I like that one. I mean, I personally, like I said, this is like my impetus for doing a lot of like mentoring and advising is like, I also love startups. So being involved in the next generation of like very early phase startups is something I'm really passionate about personally, because I feel like the attention and the investment and the resources that you get at those earliest phases are what results in the later stage unicorns, and we spend a lot of time on founders who've been repetitively successful, but those tend to not be the most diverse set of founders. So I do think, just very specifically in my world, that's definitely what I do to support the younger generations. I just want to see more people that look like me and that are, women and Hispanic and all kinds of different diverse, things represented more in those types of things. I feel like the next big wave of companies should be diverse founders.
Yeah,
thank you, Mimi. Les?
Yeah, I think this ties into your intro, Leandro, which is like where I spend my time. I obviously the stuff that I do approve, I find very, very, very interesting. But the other part is actually educational, and a lot of that is really driven by like how I watch my daughter grow up and learn. And so, like, to me, like the next stage of my life is really focused on that. Like, how can I provide a better platform for the younger generation to jump off of, and that's really where whether I do that, with Improve, whether I do that within an educational startup, like to me, it all boils down to the ability to build better thought for the younger kids. Because I could tell you, like, from my experience and my personal experience, that like I think I struggled with that very young. And I wouldn't, as I'm sure everybody here would relate, is like we never want the next generation to have to struggle like we did, right? And so I think a lot of that starts at the educational level, and whether that's education in the financial aspect of like how can you develop better financial habits, or just in the ability to actually think better. For me, like that's what I'm hoping to achieve when I'm boxed up in a box, is like to be able to say, okay, I gave to that, that next generation the ability to think about something very differently, and that, that hopefully my Hispanic and everything we talked about here today kind of comes out in that.
The only thing I could add to the two things that you both said is, in addition to think better, educate, is connect better. I think that sometimes the lack of network for either an immigrant or somebody in their own cluster, and if we have trailed away and had made connections, if we can actually help make those connections, I think that actually helps elevate everybody.
Leandro, can I add one thing to that? Because I think
Of
you hit it
course.
spot on. I think in large part, and back to Roger's point about like, how can we be better, or what can we do? It's like that network element. Like a lot of the times us, especially me, back in the day, it's like I would be scared to connect with someone, right? So like how can we bridge the gap between someone that is timid or scared to actually make that network or make that connection to entice them to kind of move to the next step. So maybe that's something that could be kind of thought about. But I completely agree. Like the networking aspect of it is like so key, because if they don't make the connection to the thought or the education, they're going to just fall off and not ever be inclusive. Like what Mimi's saying, like more diverse founders, right? Like there's great people out there with great thoughts, but they never find themselves into that network. So yeah, I think
you actually made one more excellent point that I think is important for us to know in terms of in general about Hispanic culture. Hispanic culture tends to be a little bit culturally humble and not tout your own horn like other cultures. So sometimes it's like we just want to let the work speak for itself. And while that is great, sometimes a little bit of touting your own horn also helps, and that's something that perhaps Hispanics in general don't do as much, and perhaps that doesn't help us. So I've learned a lot about that via mentorship and sponsorship, and I think it's important for us to, perhaps help elevate others in that regard. We may have time for one more question if anybody has one. Any comments, questions? Going once, going twice. Well, if we don't have anything else for now, I want to thank everybody for participating, and also specifically thank our panelists, Mimi and Les. Really appreciate your time and your openness to have an open conversation. And thank you everybody for your questions. Looking forward to continuing the conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all so much.